special education related costs. So in fiscal year 19, that made up 45% of our purchase services budget. Utilities were 17%, and students utilizing open enrollment in charter schools were 7%. Special education, as we just said, is a bulk of these items and has been increasing by 6.2% annually over the last 3 years. So one thing that has been talked about are expenses for the master planning of facilities, and these were no longer forecasted in the forecast that you have, nor the forecast that was on September's, were legal fees. So the specific legal fees that took place during that process were $7,547. The architect/assessments that were done were just about $250,000. We did an appraisal for the land, which was $3,000, and we also did a survey of $13,900. So the supply side is about 4.5% of the operating budget. Again, it's about 2 to 5% depending on which specific line item we're talking about. Textbooks are specifically purchased in this line item. The largest areas are general supplies, which are 48%, and transportation supplies, which are 26% of supplies. The next item, when you're going down top to bottom, is capital outlay. It's roughly 0.7% of the total operating budget. This is any item that has longer than a 5-year useful life. Many of these items are purchased currently in our permanent improvement fund. We currently just forecast in a $300,000 budget just in case there's any major items that are needed in case something happens. And then lastly is other objects. That's pretty descriptive. Is 1.13% of the operating budget. Again, it's 0 to 2% based on the line item. The largest line item that is charged is auditor fees for the collection of taxes. It's 63% of the other objects line item. So this is just to give you a quick general look at, these are the forecasted line items by percentage increase for the next 5 years. The black line is the average increase for all expenses. And what you can see is the ones that are driving percentages. So the ones that are driving percentages are salaries and benefits and capital outlay. At the same time, salaries and benefits make up 83% of the total budget. Capital outlay makes up 0.7% of the total budget. So the reality is what's driving percentage are these two in particular.
Kevin, could I ask a question on the purchase services? Number one, I thank you for the history and the background. So I just looked at the 400 series numbers, right, and summed them up, and basically from 17 to 19, there was $1.2 million increase in purchase services, right? And so when we talk about 2 to 4% increase in purchase services from a base, okay, the base now is $1 million more than it was 2 years ago. And so I haven't had time, since I just got these yesterday, to look at what actually is making that $1 million up, okay? I know some of it because that $1 million in 19 included those one-time expenses that you talked about, but that's maybe $300,000. But there's, you know, when we talked earlier, Kevin, it was like $697,000. So again, I haven't had a chance to dig through the numbers, but the raw numbers would indicate from $6,177,000 to $7,320,000, 17 and 19.
Sure.
So again, $1.2 million increase. And that's where I have a little bit of concern as far as the base numbers are great. Okay, give me a $100,000 raise and I increase it minus 5%, I'd be happy, right? So the base to me is key. And so as part of the discussion, I'd like to understand that $1 million increase. Although it's only 10% or 12% of your total budget,
Yeah.
it went up by $1 million in 2 years.
Yeah, we can definitely. Do you mind if we wait till the end?
No, not even today. I'm just saying that's one of the things that, as we're looking at budgeting and justifying an operating levy, we'd have to understand where the numbers are that increases it by $1 million in 2 years.
Sure.
Is it, because I've asked that question too on that specific line, is it a significant amount of that special education services?
Yeah, so we outsource a lot of our special education services. We had some pretty significant increases this past year. So, I mean, we can sit down and we can.
Right, I know that's where the 178 Title B came from. That's why I was asking, was there an equivalent offset to that because you're getting grant money specifically tied
Yeah,
to
so
that?
Yeah, so if I'm talking about IDAB, it's basically the same amount every year. So it's just taking care of what it was doing the year before. The challenge with it as well is a lot of those, and Mr. Duell could speak to that directly as well, but a lot of those expenses are teaching staff, intervention specialists. So those costs are generally increasing, yet we're not getting any more IDAB money. So those dollars are already being spent over there. So it would be something being added to the operational account. So I mean, we can look at them more.
I'm just saying, you'd have to understand, I would like to be able to see those numbers a little bit more granularity. Because it went from 6.2 to, say, ballpark 6.2 to 7.3, and then is increasing on that 7.3 number over time, is how I understood the numbers, so.
Where are you getting 7.3 on the forecast?
I'm not actually got the numbers from Kevin, so
Okay.
purchase services, all the 400 series numbers
Okay, I don't.
went from 6.177 to 6.320, or 7.320. So I was just looking at raw numbers, because again, I got this yesterday evening, I haven't had a chance to look through the details, but the raw numbers would indicate $1.2 million increase in 2 years.
Yeah.
And actually, 1 year, right? From 18 to 19, all that happened.
So if we look at, so this is the forecast numbers. It's a lot of numbers. I'm sure everybody can see this really well.
I charge me all that.
So your purchase services are 17, 18, and 19, so it's right here. So it's a little bit more than.
Yeah, but let's be honest here, that's not the problem. Right? That's not the problem we're facing. $1 million is not the problem. It's way bigger than that.
We can look at some of those details as well.
Everything
I know, but it's the personnel cost. Let's
Yep.
cut to the chase
I
here. It's
totally
the
agree with
personnel
you, buddy.
cost. When you step back,
Totally
that's
agree
the
with you.
issue that you're facing with
It
you.
created an unsustainable model.
Right. We've got
That
an
needs to be
unsustainable
addressed
system that you
now.
cannot
Right.
keep supporting. It's not gonna work.
Nope.
It'll take a rocket science to figure that out.
Right.
So we just wanted to address the permanent improvement fund quickly, although it's not in the 5-year forecast. So it works as an extension of our operating account. Purchases are limited to any items that have a useful life of 5 years or more, or the upkeep and maintenance of those items. So for example, it could be building maintenance, technology needs. The top expense items for the last 4 years are maintenance costs, 32%, technology, 25%, buses, 16%, and paying back energy efficiency bonds. So these were zero interest bonds, like 8 or 10 years ago. For energy efficiency purposes, they paid for themselves times over, but that was part of the permanent improvement fund. That rolls off in 2024. So that is not a tax savings, but it's cash that would come back to the permanent improvement fund.
Just a quick question, and again, just as a reference point, it's not to solve the issue, but Forward Edge, the spending out of this fund went from about $500,000 to 1.2 million, almost 1.3 million in 3 years. So it's just from a discussion point that I'd like to understand, what, I don't have the next level of detail of what they actually do with that money. I know it's technology only, not software, et cetera, but it's a doubling of cost. And again, $1 million here, $500,000 there, at the end of the day, it all adds up to real money. And it's fungible, right? So the money from there, if you didn't spend it on this, could be spent on something else that lasts more than 5 years. So that was just a question, not the immediate answer, but just one of the things as I was looking through, struck me that the trend was fairly significant, literally doubling in 4 years, more than doubling.
Yeah, that's
in
one
4
we,
years.
I think that's one we can easily answer
Good.
tonight as well. So we'll get that. So we just wanted to talk about the top risks in our forecast assumptions. So first is revenue, state funding, as we talked about, we're on the guarantee. So the state does a biennial budget, they do a budget every 2 years. They just passed one. And so in 2 years from now, they could have some major reforms, it could be the same. So there is some inherent risks involved in forecasting this because we're assuming that things are going to be the way they are now. So that is a revenue risk. I would say more of our risks are on the expense side. So healthcare costs, as we already talked about, some districts were 17 or 26% more. We're at 9%. We could be lower, we could be higher. It's a little bit of the art involved in forecasting. Special needs assistance, so student needs increase and staffing needs increase. So if we happen to get an influx of a population of children, we take care of them. We do everything we can to educate them, but obviously that does come at a cost. Building maintenance, so the reality is there are some concerns and issues that we do have with our buildings. So if issues do arise, that will increase our current costs. Utility expenses, we've done a good job of keeping expenses low. Mr. Ames does a fantastic job of doing that. At the same time, if there are some changes or sudden influxes, we're in consortiums, so we have consortium pricing, we have lock pricing, but if things change over time, that could obviously affect us. Future negotiated agreements, so positive or negative, and unfunded mandates. So this is a school term that we use a lot. Amy, could you talk a little bit about some specifics?
Sure. Annually, the state budget comes out, and the ODE will require school districts to do a number of things which are typically unfunded. So, for instance, the state law would require that all students graduate having CPR. So how do we make sure that all students get access to CPR? Easy answer might be make sure they do it in gym class, that a majority of our kids don't take PE class. They are athletes, and they get their PE credit by participating in a school sport or band, and soon to be show choir, as a change. So how do we make sure that those kids get access to that? Does that increase staffing? Does that increase programming? Requirements for the third grade reading guarantee, making sure that students make a certain benchmark on a test requires additional interventions, perhaps additional staff. So annually, the state will require the school district to be responsible for different things, and very rarely are there any funds that accompany those, and so those are always risks in the forecast for what we need to prepare for. We try to look ahead, we try to attend meetings and prepare for those things, but annually those things come up.
And so this is just a general conversation about reductions in expenses. So just be aware that the current deficit for the prior year was 2.8 million, it's 3.8 million this current year. We're not saying these are exactly the exact opportunities, we're just saying these are some ideas or thoughts as we start to talk about this as a group. So reductions in expenditures is reduction in programming, staffing, purchase services. Other areas to explore could be transportation, increased fees, pay to play, preschool, kindergarten tuition, general school fees, or finding opportunities within our textbooks. So again, this is just some general thoughts on it, and we're going to open it up to more conversation in just a second. So as we move forward, request for an operating levy. We just want to make sure that, we've talked about some guiding principles at the beginning. We want to prioritize expenditures that support the building and district improvement plans. So a lot of the work that has already taken place, and reduce spending from non-critical areas while requesting an operating levy. So some things to just think of as you're going through the process is the baseline is each mill roughly equals $900,000 in revenue. So that's total valuation. If you take a mill, it's $900,000 extra in revenue every year. Again, that gets to a high point and it flattens out. So we understand with this next point that we'll talk more about it. We just want to make it aware that to keep the way that things are right now without cuts in the budget and to get a minimum balance of $9 million in 3 years, an operating of 9.95 mils is required. We also realize that's not necessarily something that the community would find palatable. So when we discussed 8.95, we already knew that there were places that we were going to have to reduce costs. So that's already a conversation that we've had internally. So don't feel like this is a bait and switch or something like that. When we said 8.95, we already knew there were places that we would have to look at. Yes.
Well, I'm just a little confused as to when you would have had the opportunity to discuss that, because you were asked in a board meeting what operating levy would we have to put on to maintain, and your answer was 8.95, but you just said we discussed previously that 9.95 wouldn't be palatable, so we'd have to reduce it, but when outside of a board meeting would you have discussed that?
Well, I'm not saying necessarily with the board, I'm saying with administration and with Dr. Cross.
But just within the week between the levy passing and that board meeting, you guys knew you came up with that number?
I'm sorry?
The administrative team met the day after the levy.
Yes, we met this.
So in one day, you came up with cutting it 1 mil, and now we're several weeks later and we're not, I mean, should we be down to 6.95 mil by now then? You see what I'm saying? Like, it just seems like that was an awfully rushed to still be where we are, saying that number's on that.
I mean,
Isn't it the number that you're saying, like, that's what we need to keep things as they are?
yes.
That is, but that's not the number they gave in the board meeting.
To say that.
That's okay, I just think the timing is a little
Can
interesting
we
in that.
assume,
But
should we just start with a fresh slate and assume positive intent? I mean, I think we need to just kind of start with an assumed positive intent.
No, I think we should start with whatever questions we answered. I don't think I wasn't accusing him of anything, I'm just curious.
Where the
If that
8.9
conversation happened the very day after the levy passed, and they were already able to cut 1 mil from the needed budget, that's an awfully quick cut. Why are we still, I mean, it's now weeks later. I feel like we should be, I mean, I submitted potential cuts to Dr. Kraus weeks ago. Whether they're good or bad, or I never heard. But yet in one day, they were able to cut $900 million. That's,
I'm not sure, I
900,000.
guess I don't understand, like, you want to know about a conversation, like, can't we just start from here?
Hey Kevin, is this based off?
you can start from wherever you want. I'm starting from the last board meeting.
4%
When he said
increase a year?
8.95.
Yeah, so it's based on the current 5-year forecast. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that we came up with specifics as to what
As to
those
what
would
would
be.
be cut.
We brainstormed a list of things that stayed away from our mission and vision that we could talk about, that then Kevin and I went to try to quantify. So we did talk about some specific personnel issues, that's what we had in the executive session, to bring the board along on that. So we can have a general conversation tonight. If somebody says, let's talk about transportation, we can give some general numbers and answer some of those questions, because we've started that work, and that's what we've done for the last few weeks. So I provided in your handout, in your folder, a handout. It may or may not appeal to you. It's how I think, but anytime we talk about decisions, if we talk about a decision in March, it affects when we are going to come back. So whenever we talk about going to the ballot, we always have to talk about what would the next one look like, how much would it have to be. So if it has to do with that cash balance kind of thing. So asking for a low amount now would forecast out to ask for a higher amount later. So how do you try to balance those things out? There's an implication. If there were an easy answer between going in March and going in November, I put August on there because it's a real thing, but we're in 3 different counties, and if we're the only one on there, we have to pay for that, so it's on there. But so I put those on there for you to decide, but there's no easy answer to it. There's an implication for both. So as we're talking tonight, whenever we've been talking about it, I use this to just sort of capture implications. So as things come up that strike you, it's just a worksheet there for you to do that. That's the only reason it's there. It's something that I found useful, and perhaps you would as well.
Dr. Kraus, you were saying the implications of a March vote versus a November vote for the levy, and the difference in the budgeting based on those 2 different dates of budgeting or of votes, right? But could you help explain, as far as either one of those votes, you don't start collecting money until January of 2021. Is it a different amount of money that you would collect based on whether it's passed in March or November, or is it the same amount of money?
It's the same amount of money.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I have the right understanding. So if the ballot is in March, or the levy is in March, or the levy is in November, you start collecting the same amount of money, as long as the levy amount is the same, in January of 2021.
Correct.
Okay, so then explain to me the budgeting difference, because what you're suggesting is that there's a budgeting difference between those 2 dates. And I'm making the assumption that the budgeting difference is based on the fact that if you pass a levy in March, you have assured money coming in January for that next 21-22 school year. And if you don't have the levy in March and wait till the levy in November, then you've already gone through 4 months before you know whether you're going to have a levy approved, bringing money in January of 2021. So if you don't have the levy in March, then you would be looking at potentially wanting to do more cuts in those first 4 months of the 21-22 school year because you're not assured the money's coming in, or what is the difference? Help me.
So there's several implications. One of them would be that failure in March.
Or don't have it in March, right?
Right, failure
Either
in
way.
March, well, the implication for not having it in March would be November would be your option.
Right.
The implication for failure in having it in March and failure in March might be escalating some of those, making it harder in November. So implication.
Very good.
Implication for waiting until November and failing in November would be delaying it for an entire, if it failed in November, it would delay an entire year, which would be a significant damage to the budget. In March, if we were to fail in March, and we would be able to know what cuts had to be made into the following school year. Failure in November, you run the risk of things not being able to be cut mid-year. So for instance, transportation might be an interesting cut for people, but that can't, the law would require that can't happen mid-year. You have teacher contracts. So would you be able to safely get through the next year without doing additional cuts prior to November for fear of potentially not passing in November? So it just restricts your time frame for decision making.
Thank you.
Is the delta between the levy that failed, the operating levy was 6.95? Is this because it's a higher amount? Is that for losing a year of revenue?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's 900,000 in revenue per mill, right? So the difference between the 695 and the 995 is ballpark 2.7 million, right? So 2.7 million would make up the 3 million or the 6 million gap in 2 years. It just, the math is challenged for me there,
So,
right? Maybe it's based on inflation, or
what's that?
did I do the math wrong?
Well, so you got two things, is if the levy would have passed in November, the first revenue would have been in January. So you're looking at $6 million lost. Maybe, correct me if I'm not answering this.
No, go ahead.
So you would have had $6 million in,
2020.
I'm trying to draw this as if you can see this.
6.2 million in 2020.
So we had, you can see it's 666.
6.2.
Yeah, let's do 6.2. So 2021, 22, now you've lost that.
You lost 6.2 million in 2020.
Yes. And now you have to extend it another year to last 3 years.
Right, but you'd be, if you go to 995, you're getting 2.7 million, right? In ballpark 2 years, I could make that 6 million back up, right? 2021, 2022, I'd basically, by the end of 2022, be on the same plane as I would be if I had the 695, right? And then I'd have at least one more year of making 2.7 million more than my earlier baseline.
So you have to push it an extra year then.
If you go to 2024, then the math starts to make sense to me. But you were saying by 2023, what's your end date?
So
The other way to look at it is
yeah.
if you look at page 22 of your 5-year forecast, you could do sort of the same math, right? At the end of 2022, you got a $3 million deficit, right? But if I needed 9 million, bring it in, that's good.
Well, so let's
Now we're cooking with gas. Yeah, we are.